It is so difficult in a way to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. because there's so many different ways that one could go. It is also difficult as a white man to feel like I am permitted, if you will, to speak on that subject. How could I, a white man, speak about a person who bore the brunt in so many ways of being black and whose life was subject to threats during all the days of his public ministry, and hatred about him was such at a fever pitch that it ended in a person mad with hatred killing him. But I do think that it is a good thing that white people become aware of Reverend Martin Luther King and what he did and what he represented and what he was trying to tell. And so I feel within that framework, that narrow framework, a certain ease and comfort in speaking him. And then as earlier in this week I was thinking about what would I say, it occurred to me that we have in this congregation, subsequent to the decline of COVID, we have had new people who have come into our space, and we have people who may not understand, as many of us old-time UUs do, understand the deep connections between Unitarian Universalism and Reverend King and the Civil Rights Movement. And so I would like today to dwell on those connections, the many, many ways that Unitarian Universalist movement and the individuals who were leaders of that movement interacted with Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement generally. And while contemplating that, I realized, wait a minute, the mid-60s were a long time ago. And I kind of caught my breath and said, wow, it is a bit of ancient history to quite a number of people who might be younger than myself. Let me put what I'm about to say in context. Today and this week, people will lionize the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But the reality is, during his lifetime, he was not a popular person. A 1966 Gallup poll found that almost 2/3 of Americans had an unfavorable opinion of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And that was a 26-point unfavorable rate increase from 1963, which is to say, the more his work and message got out in the public domain, the less the American public generally thought well of it. However, the Unitarian Universalist movement was a strong and consistent supporter of the civil rights movement throughout the 1960s and of Reverend King specifically. Examples of these interconnections are too plentiful to describe in detail, but one of them is the following. In January 1965, a campaign for voting rights was launched in Selma, Alabama, just about 2 hours south from where I was born and lived my early life. The marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, where they were met by a group of state troopers and local police. After refusing to disperse, the marchers were attacked with clubs. This became known as Bloody Sunday. In response, Reverend King called for religious leaders all over America to join him in Selma for a rebuttal to this brutality. Now, he planned a march that was approximately 3 months after Bloody Sunday. Dr. King, if you read his writings, he was forever bemoaning the lack of response from religious leaders to what he was trying to do. At that event, that response to Bloody Sunday, 40 Unitarian Universalist ministers answered Dr. King's call. And they appeared on March the 9th, about 2.5 months after Bloody Sunday. I knew many of the ministers who did this. At that gathering, on March 9th, there were in total 400 religious leaders from all over America who joined 2,000 African Americans to march over the bridge. They went to the site of the attack, kneeled and prayed, and then returned back to Selma. Please take note that 10% of the clergy who showed up on that day were Unitarian Universalists, at the very time in which the number and the percentage of Unitarian Universalists in the whole country was far less than 1%. So there was a tremendously strong, disproportionate showing of Unitarian Universalist ministers. A UU minister by the name of Reverend James Reeb was among them. That night, Reeb and 2 other UU ministers were attacked outside a whites-only restaurant in Selma. Reverend Reeb died 2 days later. 4 days later, on March the 15th, 1965, Reverend King delivered the eulogy for Reverend Reeb in Brown Chapel, Selma, Alabama. And here is part of what he said. Naturally, he said, we are compelled to ask the question, who killed James Reeb? The answer is simple and limited when we think of the who. He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who had the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. But there is another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask this afternoon. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? And when we move from who to what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows. Then Reverend King goes on to answer his own question. Now bear in mind, this is March the 15th, 1965. James Reeb, he said, was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a tailgate rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery. Do we know any of those today? Who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff and law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. Do we know any of such cases today? There were numerous institutional connections between Reverend King and the community of the UUA. Everett Parker, director of the UU Office of Communication, which provided communication infrastructure for King and those who were around him and filed complaints on media bias against King and the civil rights movement with the Federal Communication Commission. Clark Olson, a UU minister who worked as a regional director for the SCLC in the 1960s and was deeply involved in voter registration. Additionally, there were hundreds of ministers and lay people who were involved in multiple ways within the civil rights movement. An example, and I could quote many, was in my first UU congregation in Florida, the minister who had been there at that church during the civil rights movement was a man named Charles White McGee. And Reverend McGee was paralyzed from his waist down. But he had ways of nevertheless being able to walk and move around if he received assistance. And in the southern city in which he resided, he was in every march despite his disability, and he spoke very frequently of the civil rights movement. In that same congregation, I should say, there were dozens and dozens of people who helped. One of them, who I got to know well, was an FBI informant, and he worked undercover inside the KKK. And if you met him and talked to him today, you would think he is a living, breathing embodiment of what one thinks about when you say KKK. He risked his life on multiple occasions. He helped to bring some really bad characters down. And his was a most heroic example, but there were many others. There were many, many personal connections between UUs and Reverend King. And one of those was Reverend Eugene Pickett, the senior minister for years at the UUA in Atlanta, who I know many of you know, and he's a well-known figure. The following is part of a letter written by Reverend King on March the 15th, 1965, to Reverend Pickett. Dear Reverend Pickett, in the rush of events surrounding Selma and our Alabama voting project, I neglected to express my deepest gratitude for your sponsorship of the dinner honoring me on the 26th of January. Please accept my deepest appreciation for you and for what you do. Sincerely, Martin Luther King. The broad depth and strength of the connection between the Unitarian Universalist movement and Dr. King was also reflected on May the 18th, 1966, when Dr. King spoke to the annual assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Hollywood, Florida. This was 1966. The General Assembly is a meeting of all the ministers, the directors of religious education, the staff people, and lay leaders of congregations all over America. So it is our single biggest annual gathering. And the title of his speech was, "Don't Speak or Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." In the introductory remarks, Dr. Dana Greeley, the president of UUA, indicated what UU leaders thought of Dr. King and what he was doing. Preacher, reformer, citizen, man of peace, lover of justice, we offer him not only our respect, but our love and loyal support. It is a great privilege to give you Dr. Martin Luther King. And then Dr. King began his remarks by saying, "I need not pause to say how delighted I am to be here tonight. There are those wonderful moments in life when you speak before a group, that is so near and dear to you that you don't feel like you have to engage at all in the art of persuasion. You don't feel like you're in the midst of strangers. You know that you are with friends. I can assure you that I feel that way tonight. After the tragic death, the murder of Reverend King, the following thank you letter was written by Coretta Scott King to Reverend Eugene Pickett, senior minister of the Atlanta Church. Dear Reverend Pickett, please convey to your members of your congregation my deepest appreciation for their help at the time of my husband's death. Their concern and sympathy were demonstrated in many ways and made a tragic and confused period less trying for me and my family. It would have been impossible to provide for the many visitors in my home without the generosity of the members of the Atlanta Unitarian Church. The food, the transportation, and lodging which they provided will be remembered as a tangible demonstration of the brotherhood in action which the Unitarian Church has always stressed. Opening, sorting, and handling the tremendous amount of mail sent to me and my children would have been an insurmountable task without the help of the people who responded to the Unitarian Church's appeal. Through the years, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta has been a leader in bridging the gap between the white and black communities. My family and I will always remember how warmly and willingly you extended friendship and love during our most difficult hours. Please know that we will always be grateful. Sincerely yours, Coretta Scott King. Dr. King is a historic figure on many levels. But one of those levels is his role as someone who took on the monumental task of attempting to bring this country back to whatever moral and spiritual roots it had at its founding. His critique of our society and culture and the necessity to reform and move toward the highest meaning of our national ideals began with his critique of racial injustice in the Deep South. That theme always flowed through his messages and was of central importance. But with the passage of time, with the vast knowledge he acquired through his interactions with leaders and community people all over this country, he began to develop a critique of poverty, of the deep structural, systematic ways in which our society works to the disadvantage of a certain minority. He provided a critique of the ideological and organizational underpinnings of systematic injustice, and not just the specific acts of injustice themselves. He began to see the links and to call out the links between racism, imperialism, the lobbying industry, poverty, and social justice. And so it was that King's goal, starting with a desire to bring about racial justice, voting justice, and racial equality, transformed over time into an immensely ambitious and far-reaching goal to bring America back in alignment with its most precious core values. Not since the beginning of the Republic has anyone tried such an attempt. If you are new here, having just visited us, or just getting to know us, or if you're young and of a certain age and therefore you have the Civil Rights Movement as a distant memory, please know and be aware that this UU movement had a very close relationship to Reverend King and to the Civil Rights Movement in myriad ways that I cannot begin to describe with my brief remarks today. Dr. King would not want us to idealize him. He would want us to follow in his steps, however humble that might be. When Reverend King spoke at Reverend Reeb's memorial service, one of the last things he said is the greatest tribute that we can pay to James Reeb is to continue the work he so nobly started but could not finish because his life, like the Schubert Unfinished Symphony, was cut off at an early age. We might say the same thing about King and ourselves. One way I think to honor King is by the consideration and serious discussion within this congregation of the 8th principle that is proposed as a further principle of our religious movement. The proposed 8th principle encapsulates many core themes of the life and teaching of Reverend King. But let us let Reverend King have the last word. At Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia, on February the 4th, 1968, he said, several months before he was murdered on April the 4th, 1968, the following. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. I'd like to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for someone to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. And I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. That I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind, but I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say.